We interrupt this record to bring you a special bulletin. The reports of a flying saucer hovering over the city have been confirmed.
Did you really go out with an alien? Uh-huh. What was it like? Real different.
Becoming Human, a Mork and Mindy podcast. Hello, listeners. This is Paula Schaffner with episode 29, Mork vs. Mindy. This first aired on October 14th, 1979. The IMDb synopsis is, Mork and Mindy compete to earn a job working for Nelson. It was directed by Howard Storm, his 20th Mork and Mindy episode, and written by David Mish, and it was his 4th. We start with the sunny exterior of the house. Mindy is pouring herself a cup of coffee. There's a knock, and she asks who it is, but the knocking continues. She opens the door to Mork and screams at the sight of him because he's got sort of a crab-like monster mask on his face. Mindy says that the novelty store is a bad influence on him. Mork says he saw an incredible movie. I think that the movie is Alien, which was released on May 25th of that year. Mindy says that Mork scared her to death. He says sorry, and his boss said that this would be funny. Mork adds that he thought an alien would be funny too, so that's why I think it's the movie Alien. He takes off the mask and asks it, was it good for you, as he likes to do to inanimate objects. Mindy says she doesn't like Mork bringing his work home. There's a close-up of a squirting flour on one of his suspenders. She gets a dish towel. He offers to help her dry off, but then he uses his joy buzzer. She hits him with the towel. He looks amused. He says he doesn't know much about Earth humor. She says, I have a few bleems to understand you Orkans. So I think that's the first time that Mindy uses the word bleems.
By the way, what is this message you left for me?
NFCSTHWCO.
And what does that mean? And what does that mean?
Nelson Flavor called and said that he would come over.
Mork is learning shorthand because he wants an exciting career as a credit neurologist. Mindy explains that Nelson Flavor is her cousin, the son of her crazy rich aunt. I don't know if this is Fred's sister or Mindy's mother's sister, but I'm going to guess the latter. Mork asks what a cousin is. She says that it's somebody who's related to your parents. So it implies that she's not fond of this cousin. Mork says that she struck a sour note. Because Mork is a test tube baby, even he isn't related to his parents. So I think that's the first mention of him being a test tube baby this season. It's not as big a deal as it was in the first season. Mork has never met Nelson. Mindy describes him as so straight, as in bland and maybe establishment and square, which seems odd if he's the son of her crazy aunt. Nelson manufactures attaché cases. Mork says that sounds like a brief career, pun, but that's his bag, and then he does his bark laugh at that pun. Mindy says she always got the feeling that Nelson is always trying to sell you something. He's always slapping you on the back and shaking your hand. Mork says that sounds like a combination mugger and masseuse. Mindy says Mork has a way of looking at the bright side. He says he has to because today he got fired from his job. Mindy says not another one. So I don't know how many jobs he's lost. Maybe there's been one since the Science Museum guard last episode. Mork got fired because he sold a whoopee cushion to a deaf man. Although, if the deaf man wanted to buy it, what's the problem? He's going to be trained on other people. Mindy says she has only 3 music students left. This is the first time that it's mentioned that Mindy gives music lessons. This never came up in season 1. Mindy says they're starting to run kind of low on money. Mork says he has another possibility for a job today, feeding animals at the zoo, especially the baby elephants. He wants to take them out for Chinese food, but probably the MSG would make them a little hyper. And then as Mindy goes to get the door because someone's knocking again, he says something that we can't really hear. We can kind of hear the laughter to it. But with the subtitles on, it says, maybe I'll get them stoned first, and they'll get the munchies. So my guess is that the censors had the volume turned down, but for some reason that still got subtitled on the DVD. So yes, Robin Williams making a drug joke. Mindy lets in a tall blonde man who has a suit, a tie, glasses, and a briefcase. He calls her Mindy McConnell and gives her a long handshake. So even though we can guess that this is her cousin, he's still pretty formal with her, so that's part of his straightness. He says he's Nelson Flavor at your service, and he gives her one of his cards. She says she'd give him one of her cards, but she left it in her other dress, and actually she's just wearing a blouse and jeans. He says she's such a little kidder. They used to have such fun. Mindy introduces her good friend Mork. Mork shakes hands with Nelson but uses the joy buzzer. Nelson says that they are two little kidders. Mindy says that Mork was working in a novelty shop. Nelson keeps chuckling, so he's a good sport about this. Nelson says that Mindy is his most favorite cousin, and then he has to be honest, she's his only cousin. So whichever side of the family that is, you can throw in that data point. He stopped by to say, "Hey, how you doing?" She says she's fine. Since Dad and Grandma sold the music store, she's been teaching music on the side. So I guess Eugene and the other students weren't totally abandoned. At least Mindy is teaching some of them. And I thought it was interesting, she doesn't mention that she's studying journalism, but admittedly he does interrupt her to tell her his fantastic news. He's decided to go into politics. She guesses that she won't be getting an attaché case this Christmas, and she says darn. He says she still will because the city council post is just part-time, so he'll be keeping his business. She wishes him the best of luck, but points out that the election is over a year away. And since this aired in mid-October, that sounds about right. He says he's got to start now if he wants his name to be a household word. Mork says, like, fungus or Johnny Mop. Nelson says there are many, many women in his district, and he wanted to ask Mindy what they think. She asks about what? He says anything, and as an example, he gives radioactive fallout. She says they're against it. Mork in falsetto says, "Hell no, we won't glow," which I think was an anti-nuclear slogan of the time. Nelson says there's a lot more to this political business than meets the old eyeball. The city council post is a stepping stone to the pinnacle, the ultimate. Mork guesses that this would be owning your own gas station, so I guess that's another joke about high gas prices this season. Nelson wants to be the next vice president of the United States, like his hero, Walter Mondale. Mindy says that's quite an ambition. Nelson asks if he's aiming too high, but that's what he wants out of life. He's studied everything about Walter, who lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Mork says he thought that he lived in obscurity. Nelson wants to have everything that Walter has. The power, the glory, everything. Mork is confused. Isn't the purpose of every politician to serve the people and help them? Nelson says that's a heck of an idea. It's just crazy enough to work. He'll do this to help people. Mindy says if Nelson is interested in the female point of view, he should hire her. He says she could be his campaign staff. He asks how soon she can start, and she says sooner if necessary. He says, good, let's go. So they're both very enthusiastic. Mindy asks Mork to call Jeannie to tell her that she can't meet her for lunch because she has a job. And so this is another example of Jeannie being referred to off-screen and continuing the idea that this is Mindy's best female friend these days. Mork wishes Nelson a great election, even though it's a year off. After Nelson and Mindy exit, Mork notices that something is gone. He calls Mindy's name a few times and opens the door. Mindy comes back, and Mork's exploding cigar explodes on Nelson off stage. Nelson returns, and the audience is just really amused by this. Nelson says that it's a big joke until somebody gets hurt. You could put an eye out. I will comment more on the character of Nelson towards the end. We get a daytime exterior at the deli. There are two young men at a table as Remo explains stickball with a broomstick. There's a guy in overalls who says absolutely nothing about this will help him grow as a person. And as the two guys leave, Remo talks about playing stickball in the street from sewer to sewer. He says, you ain't a man till you hit 3 sewers. I will mention right now that Jim Staahl aside, the guest stars are not particularly notable, with the partial exception of the guy in overalls who is simply listed as customer. The actor is Jeff Harlan, who may look familiar because he is Bill from the Mork Mindy pilot. Yes, that is the man who stole Mindy's Jeep. I'm assuming it's a different character unless he has grown as a person enough that he's no longer stealing Jeeps and he's wearing overalls and thinking about his depth as a human being. Odd return there. By the way, Mr. Bickley is again absent. Jeannie tells Remo, so much for bringing the Bronx to Boulder, and she says that Remo should have told the guys that the stick was organic. Remo says these people, meaning Boulderites, are incredible. Jeannie says they don't even leave her tips. Well, one guy does tip transcendentally. Remo says next time she should give him a transcendental burger. No buns, no meat. So there's this supposedly hilarious culture clash between stereotypical New York and stereotypical Boulder. Jeannie says Mork and Mindy are the only normal people they've met. So when Mork enters, Remo says, "Speak of the devil."
The devil? Yea, though he wanders around, he can hide in the crap block and nail you. Come forward now. He can leave the potato salad. Do you know why I say pourquoi? Do you know why? Do you believe, or are you asking me possibly pourquoi? Pourquoi? Butter, come on home. You believe
So yeah, we get Mork doing a televangelist routine again. But I thought the most interesting thing here was the use of pourquoi, which is French for why, and that allows Mork to reference the Parquet commercial of that time, because Parquet and pourquoi sound enough alike.
Butter. Butter.
Parquet. Margarine. The big 1 pound bowl.
Butter.
Parquet. I use the bowls for leftovers and things.
Jeannie says at least Mindy's normal. Mork says he got fired from another job. He and Remo sit down. Remo asks what happened this time. Mork says he fed the baby elephants peanut butter. Their trunks got stuck to the roof of their mouths, and one of the baby elephants sneezed and flew across the zoo. So this is another unseen job of Mork's, not only the novelty shop, but also when he was working at the animal shelter. Mork says he does have an idea for a corporate franchise. It'll be called Mork's Ice Palace. As Jeannie comes over, Mork says that the motto is, "I only have ice for you, the best you ever thaw." 2 bad puns back to back. Jeannie sets down the drink she brought over. It looks like iced tea. She rests her hand on Remo's shoulder. Jeannie says that's a great idea, but what about when summer comes? Mork says he'll stop production because he doesn't want to flood the market. Remo tells him to not be discouraged. He must have tried a dozen different jobs before he found something he really liked. Lying in the sun. Jeannie moves her hand to Remo's back and says she's really proud of her big brother. He gave up all that to put her through med school. And Remo puts his hand around her hips and lifts his glass as if in a toast. So again, odd sibling dynamic. And in this episode, they don't actually bicker. Mork wishes he had a job so he could be proud of himself. Remo tells him not to worry about it. Nelson comes in and enthusiastically greets Mork and, of course, shakes his hand. Remo stands next to Jeannie, and Mork introduces them as Remo and Jean. And occasionally they would refer to her as Jean. It allows there to be this little joke mixing up their names as he shakes their hands, as if Remo is Jean, Gene. He asks if they're registered voters. They are, in New York. So he takes back the campaign flyers he just handed them. Nelson and Mork sit down as Nelson says he wants Mork's help with a little problem. Remo says Mork will make it into a big problem. Jeannie scolds him and they step away. Nelson says he has too much work for Mindy to handle. He'd like to hire Mork too.
Me? There's no one else here you mean me? Oh, joyous exultation. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Hot dog. Yeah. Whoa. I'm okay now. Hey! Out of the way, boy. Play hard to get.
So we get a little bit of Mork doing the stage directions thing. Nelson says that Mindy said that Mork is very conscientious. He's going to make Mork into his executive assistant. Mork wonders if he doesn't have to work now that he's an executive. They'll take a meeting on it. They stand up and shake hands again. Mork calls him NF. He says to have Nelson's service call his service. Nelson says that Mork can call him N, and he can call him anything he wants as long as he doesn't call him for dinner. And then he laughs and says he loves that joke because he has a very corny sense of humor, even cornier than the Da Vinci's or Mindy's. Jeannie wishes Mork good luck. Remo tells Morko not to blow it. After Nelson leaves, Mork goes to another table and grabs some coins off the top. Jeannie stops him. Mork says that people always seem to forget the money, so he's going to give it back to them if he can find them. She says it's her money. He tells her to describe it. She says it's round and silver, so he says, "Boy, is my face red." And you would think he had run into the concept of tipping before now, but apparently not. And also, Jeannie just minutes ago said that these Boulder people don't tip her. Did they have to do that joke in the very same scene? No continuity. We get another daytime shot of the mall, but it turns out that Nelson's headquarters are also at the mall. How convenient. Mork is singing something about flavors, I guess punning on Nelson's name, and he refers to political innuendo. So I don't know if something more suggestive got chopped out or what that's about. Mindy sarcastically says that she had no idea that political activism could be so stimulating. Mork says, really? I'm kind of bored. Mindy says at least they're getting paid. Mork says $80 a week isn't very much. Mindy is only making $60. Mork says he's an executive. Mindy says her title is office girl. Mork says to get him a dress and he can be an office girl too. Again, Mork being somewhat gender fluid. Nelson comes in the front door and greets them. He wants to shake Mindy's hand, but she wants to know why he's paying Mork more than her. And it is because Mork is an executive. She asks what this means. Does Mork have a bigger stapler? Nelson says Mork does all the important, difficult jobs, so that Mindy is free to make coffee. She gets to her feet. She asks if he's some kind of male chauvinist. She says she doesn't mind making a little coffee every now and then, but there's no reason Mork shouldn't do it too. Mork stands up and says he'll get a pan and fry up some coffee right now. And at that time, coffee making was somewhat politicized. You can see this in the movie 9 to 5 the following year. The assumption that the secretary or whatever job that a woman had included the responsibility of making coffee. It was very weighted. And so I thought that was interesting that it comes up here. Nelson stands up again too and says he's sorry, but he thought making coffee was what women did. Isn't it genetic? He specifically has that prejudice. He says he's getting some negative vibes right now. He asks Mindy if he should hire another girl. She says, why not let the boy do it? So Mork goes into, I'm trying to think of how to describe this. It is a stereotype that might be called Rastus or Sambo, and was portrayed by the actor Willie Best, who had the unfortunate screen name of Sleep and Eat. It really undercuts the feminist point that this scene is trying to make by Mork going into this boy stereotype that's associated with African American men. It's not funny and it's uncomfortable, and I think even in 1979 it was really tasteless, but at least it's brief. Nelson says the entire subject, meaning of who gets coffee, is academic. He has very important news, because obviously every piece of news in his life is fantastic and important in his perspective. He and Mork sit on the front of the desk. He says after close scrutiny of his financial status, he can only afford to pay one of his assistants. Now, along with all the other things, including his ignorance, I would think right there that would disqualify him as a competent politician, that he can't even figure out how to manage his staff. He hires one person who happens to be his cousin, so it's kind of nepotistic, and then a short time later he hires another, but he doesn't really consider whether he can afford both of them. And as the episode goes on, he also is just really bad about making decisions. So I would not vote with flavor. Mork says that this is the first job he was ever able to keep, and he's not able to keep it. Nelson says he doesn't want to fire Mork. His work's been excellent. Mindy says that Nelson can't fire her because he would die of thirst, because obviously people get their fluids through coffee. Nelson says in the true spirit of American competition, he'll let the two of them battle it out to the death. Mork objects because he cares a lot about Mindy, and also what would he do without himself? Nelson says this is a figure of speech. He'll observe the two of them for a couple of days and decide on one of them. Mork says to let her have it. She needs the job more than he does. Mindy says she does want this job, but Mork can't just give up. If you want something, you've got to fight for it. Mork says he doesn't want to fight her. She says it's not that kind of fight. And this is just a few episodes after Mork learned about arguments. Apparently one of the themes this year will be learning how to properly fight with Mindy, as the title suggests. Oh boy, not what I signed up for. She says that competing is healthy. He says he doesn't want her to have to compete against herself, so he will compete. Nelson wishes them good luck and says, may the best man win. We get a similar outdoor shot of the mall. Mork and Mindy are in the same outfit, so it's probably later that day. They're both seated at the desk. Nelson enters from the back room and yawns, so presumably time has passed. He asks for coffee, so Mindy runs to get a cup and says that it's just the way he likes it. He says he didn't want any cream. I don't know how long the coffee has been sitting around. Presumably not too long, it's still warm. And then Mork gets a tray with 8 cups of coffee on it. He says it's the history of coffee right here. There's cappuccino, espresso, coffee with cream, coffee without cream, with sugar, and with lots of sugar for your hypoglycemics. So the second hypoglycemic joke this season.
Coffee with no coffee at all. Oh, listen, can you hear inflation? Too late.
Very impressive. Very impressive. But why do you have one without coffee?
Well, it's kind of a Zen coffee. Doesn't keep you awake at night and gives you kind of that nirvana buzz.
So again, Zen, kind of Buddhist philosophy coming through from Mork. Nelson twice says that Mork is very efficient, and he takes a sip and exits back to the back room. Mork calls himself efficient, and he calls himself Morko, like Remo likes to. And he marks a score of 1 in the air. Then he and Mindy have a conversation through gritted teeth. He asks if she's mad. She asks if she looks mad. He says no, and she tells him she's mad. He says that he thought that they would both try to do the job as best they could. She says he's trying to prove he can hold on to a job, and she's trying to prove that Nelson is a sexist. He asks, don't all humans have sex? And I'm not sure if he means intercourse or gender, but it's kind of left there. She explains that some people believe that men are more capable than women. He says that's ridiculous. Men and women are equal throughout the universe, which I thought was nice. And then he says, except on Venus, because dogs rule the planet and cats have to make the coffee. So this confirms the thing from earlier episodes and the Mork Mindy book that Venus is populated by dogs. I don't know what Exodore thinks of that. Mindy says they're acting ridiculous. They'll handle the situation in a mature, adult manner. Then a man comes in the front door and they both go to him. He sells prosthetic dog ears for Doberman pinschers. He caters to the curb trade. They compete to help him, and they badger him so badly that he hides in the closet. And at one point, Mork says that Nelson is vanilla, meaning bland. He melts in the sun with a cherry on top. Nelson returns from the back room, and they pretend nothing's going on, but the man opens the door. Nelson says that he'll help the man with his problem, but first he'll have to come out of the closet. And Mork says, I don't think that's his problem, as in the man is not gay. The man says to tell the goons to take a walk first, so Nelson has Mork and Mindy back off. The city is tearing up the pavement in front of the man's store. He thought maybe Nelson could stop it. Nelson says no problem, he'll take care of it personally just as soon as he's elected, and he ushers the man out, giving him a campaign hat and a brochure. Before the man goes, he says, word of advice, Flavor. With those two around, I wouldn't run for office, I'd run for cover. Mindy suggests there might be a good reason the city is tearing up the man's sidewalk. Nelson says it's a more complex issue than he thought. He tells Mork to give him a full report on the subject. He suggests the title, Sidewalks, Not All They're Cracked Up to Be. Need Concrete Solution. Nelson says this is fantastic, and he likes the way Mork thinks. Mindy says that she should make the report because she was hired first. She could point out that she's a journalism major, but she doesn't. She says she has seniority, and Mork says, so now you're pretending to be Mexican? As in seniority? Mindy says if Nelson wants to get elected, he has to pay attention to the women's vote. She says that Mrs. Hodges is the head of the Women's Political League in Boulder. She's a very important person. Nelson notices that she's a woman, too. His landlady is also a woman. Mork says they're everywhere. Mindy says she can help Nelson with all of the women. Nelson says that Mork has the political savvy, and Mindy has all the contacts.
Mork, prepare a report on who you think I should hire for this. Give me in triplicate, give me the original, you keep a copy, and throw a copy away.
And I include that clip because that is the closest that Nelson gets to being funny in this episode, even if it's pretty much stolen from a Marx Brothers movie. Nelson says he'll make his decision this evening. They can take the night off now. He'll see one of them later. Get it? And he exits. Mork says they'll be mature and deal with this as adults. And then he says he'll race her home. She waves her car keys and says that she has wheels. He says he's got more of them, and now suddenly he's wearing roller skates. She runs out, and he skates out and hits the brick wall. We get a sunny exterior of the house. Mork asks if Mindy is still mad at him. She asks if she looks mad, and he says yes, so she says he's catching on. He asks what's wrong, and he says they used to have so much fun. She says it's all because of this dumb job. He says she should take the dumb job. She says tomorrow morning they'll both go down there and tell Nelson if he can't find the money to pay both of them, they both quit. She asks if it's a deal, and he says on Orc they call it a partnership or a group corporation. She says it's the same thing on Earth. He says, small world, aren't it? There's a knock, and he says it sounds like somebody with knuckles. Mindy lets Nelson in, and he shakes her hand. He was out politicking in the neighborhood, and he thought he'd come by. He made his decision. Mindy says they made their decision, too. No job is worth what he's been putting them through. She and Mork care for each other very much, but having to compete like this is making them act like different people, and they don't like those kind of people. Either he hire both of them, or they both quit.
I accept your resignation.
That's none of your political jargon right now. I don't want any Nixonisms. I want the real truth and honest answer. Come on now, clown prince. How about, whew, right here. I'm ready for it. Let me have it.
That was an answer. We're out.
We are?
So yeah, another Nixon reference. Nelson says he's terribly sorry, but he realized he has a moral obligation to hire a minority. He opens the door to Susie, who's a pretty young blonde woman. She's Swedish. Mork says this should help with the bleached vote, as in bleach blonde. Nelson is speaking at a women's rights rally tomorrow, and he wants Mindy to suggest a good subject. She sarcastically says, looking nice for Mr. Right, and he sincerely thanks her. Then he says us blondes are going to have more fun. He refers to Rod Stewart, I guess because Rod Stewart was a blonde rock star. Susie thinks that they're going to see Rod Stewart, but they're not. Mork says he lost another job. Mindy points out that he's already got a job observing Earth, which came up very early in season 1, but apparently now they feel that Mork needs an Earth job. She says he's doing pretty well at being an observer, so what does it matter that he's having a little trouble finding the right Earth job? She says at least they're friends again. He says they haven't sealed their partnership. She says on Earth you shake hands. He says on Orc you trade clothes, and he starts to lower his suspenders. Another bit of cross-dressing, although we don't get to see it, unfortunately. There's a nighttime exterior of the house. Mork summons Orson, and he swings by on a rope. Orson asks if Mork finally got that job he's been talking about, and I don't know which job that's in reference to. Mork says, not exactly, your bloatness. He says that everyone on Earth competes with each other in sports, work, everything. Orson wonders what they get if they win. Mork says it's something called an ulcer. He doesn't know what that is, but it must be wonderful because everyone who's successful gets one. Orson guesses it'll be a while before Mork puts an ulcer on his mantelpiece. And Mork says, oh no shoe, Chief Smoke. I don't know what this means, and I couldn't really find out from the internet, but that's what the subtitles said. Mork says that he and Mindy had to compete. Orson asks who won. Mork says they both did because they decided to stick together. Orson says that Mork is learning about cooperation and maturity. Mork says, oh yes, your preachiness. A little bit of lamp shading on that. Mork says if you want that ulcer, it's no fun if you lose the one that you want to share it with. And he signs off. We finally get Jim Staahl as Nelson Flavor. And ironically, even though we had seen him in the opening credits, he's not there this time. He shows up in a listing in the end credits. So I'm not sure if maybe the air date order was very different than the filming order. In any case, no offense to Jim Staahl, but this is an extremely bland, unfunny character. We've already got the Da Vinci's, who are just wildly colorful. At the time, and now, it just really saps a lot of the energy out of the episode and out of the series. I think that there were possibly ways to make this work. If you've seen the movie Groundhog Day, the character of Ned Ryerson is an insurance salesman, and he's very quote-unquote straight, but it's a wonderful little comic role that gave Bill Murray a lot to play off of. They could have gone in a direction like that for Nelson, where there were other possibilities to make this come alive, but it didn't happen. I vaguely recall liking one or two Nelson episodes, but I just felt that he was one of the most unnecessary characters of the series. Other than it gives us a little more about Mindy's family, but yeah, I would much rather have Fred and Cora back. They could have made the whole thing with politics and him being an ignorant politician. Maybe could have worked, but again, we needed stronger writing. And the thing of him choosing Walter Mondale as a role model is meant to be funny because vice presidents have always had a reputation of being somewhat useless. Of course, it is ironic that he admires Walter Mondale, who was actually more liberal than President Carter, and would go on to select a female running mate, Geraldine Ferraro, in 1984. I don't think Mondale would have been flattered. Ironically, Jeannie and Remo come off better in this episode than others. Although, like I said, there's such a weird sibling dynamic with these two. No Mr. Bickley. I think we do get to see him interact with Nelson later, but nothing is immediately coming to mind. It has been a few years since I've watched these episodes. And I also feel like some of Mork's humor is cornier. I mean, he's always made puns and stuff, but the writing is not great here. And I feel it is, again, somewhat out of character for both Mork and Mindy in this episode. The whole thing of him needing to get a job, but is it about his pride or is it about bringing money in? And why does Mindy leap at the chance to work for a cousin she doesn't like? And presumably this would be for a year. Maybe they were testing the waters. You know, maybe if the audience embraced Nelson, then that would have been Mindy's major arc for season 2, is campaigning for his election the following fall. But they pretty much shoot that in the foot, and both Mork and Mindy lose this job that they competed over. The guest stars are not memorable. The man who comes in who does the prosthetic ears for Doberman Pinschers is like, I know you're trying to be funny, but I'm not getting anything out of this. I rate each of these episodes on a 0 to 4 egg scale, which measures how well it fits what I'm looking for in the series. And as with the season premiere, I'm going to give it a 2. While I did have quite a few issues with Mork's Baby Blues, which I gave a 2.5, I at least felt it was lively. I felt that Dinah Manoff was trying her darndest. Although the writing was flawed, it was interesting to see it and to talk about it. This one, I was very impatient to just get to the end. But it's not terrible. It's just right dead down in the middle. There are a few little moments I like. Mork and Mindy recognizing that this isn't who they want to be, that their friendship is more important than this dumb job. I also rate these episodes on a 0 to 4 heart scale, which measures how much it promotes the romantic relationship of Mork and Mindy. And this is the low so far this season. There just really wasn't anything romantic about it at all. Even when they reconcile, it felt very platonic. So I'm going with a half star. I wouldn't say it's a 0. There is maybe, if you squint, a little bit of shippiness, but we're not given much to work with. So I'd have to say so far, other than you probably need to watch this because it introduces Nelson, and that will impact the rest of the season and will produce actually one of my favorite season 2 episodes down the line, of the one where they have a fundraiser for Nelson. I'd almost say skip this. Watch it for completeness. It's not a good time. It's not a terrible time, but it's not a good time. This finishes off disc 1. We'll see how disc 2 goes. We've got some more memorable stuff down the road. 2 eggs, half a heart. This is Paula Schaffner with episode 29, Mork versus Mindy. Nanu Nanu in 1980.
Squint your eyes and look closer. I'm not between you and your ambition. I am a poster girl with no poster. I am 32 flavors and then some. And I'm beyond your peripheral vision. So you might want to turn your head. Cause someday you are gonna get hungry and eat most of the world.